The minor problem now presented itself of where to have lunch, and with scarcely a moment's consideration he dismissed those large, noisy and bustling restaurants which lie near Piccadilly Circus. After a morning spent with Eve Halliday and the young man who was going about the place asking people to steal his aunt's necklace, it was imperative that he select some place where he could sit and think quietly. Any food of which he partook must be consumed in calm, even cloistral surroundings, unpolluted by the presence of a first violin who tied himself in knots, and an orchestra in whose lexicon there was no such word as piano. One of his clubs seemed indicated. In the days of his prosperity, Smith's father, an enthusiastic clubman, had enrolled his son's name on the list of several institutions. And now, although the lean years had arrived, he was still a member of 6, and he would continue to be a member till the beginning of the new year, and the consequent call for fresh subscriptions. These clubs ranged from the drones, frankly frivolous, to the senior conservatives, solidly worthy. Almost immediately Smith decided that for such a mood as was upon him at the moment, the latter might have been specially constructed. Anybody familiar with the interior of the Senior Conservative Club would have applauded his choice. In the whole of London no better haven could have been found by one desirous of staying his interior with excellently cooked food, while passing his soul under a leisurely examination. They fed you well at the drones, too, no doubt, but their youth held carnival, and the thoughtful man, examining his soul, was apt at any moment to have his meditations broken in upon by a chunk of bread dexterously thrown by some bright spirit at an adjoining table. No horror of that description could possibly occur at the Senior Conservative. The Senior Conservative has 6,111 members. Some of the 6,111 are more respectable than the others, but they are all respectable, whether they be numbered among the oldest inhabitants, like the Earl of Emsworth, who joined as a country member in 1888, or among the recent creations of the last election of candidates. They are bald, reverend men who look as if they are on their way to the city to preside at a directors' meeting, or have dropped in after conferring with the Prime Minister at Downing Street as to the prospects at the coming by-election in the Little Wobsley division. With the quiet dignity which atoned for his lack in years in this stronghold of mellow worth, Smith mounted the steps, passed through the doors which were obligingly flung open for him by 2 uniformed dignitaries, and made his way to the coffee-room. Here, having selected a table in the middle of the room, and ordered a simple and appetizing lunch, he gave himself up to thoughts of Eve Halliday. As he had confessed to his young friend Mr. Walderwick, she had made a powerful impression upon him. He was tearing himself away from his daydreams in order to wrestle with a mutton chop, when a foreign body shot into his orbit and blundered heavily against the table. Looking up, he perceived a long, thin, elderly gentleman of pleasantly vague aspect, who immediately began to apologize. "My dear sir, I'm extremely sorry. I trust I've caused you no damage." "None whatever," replied Smith courteously. "The fact is, I've mislaid my glasses, blind as a bat without them, can't see where I'm going." A gloomy-looking young man with long and disordered hair, who stood at the elderly gentleman's elbow, coughed suggestively. He was shuffling restlessly and appeared to be anxious to close the episode and move on. A young man, evidently of highly strung temperament, he had a sullen air. The elderly gentleman started vaguely at the sound of the cough. "Eh?" he said, as if in answer to some unspoken remark. "Oh, yes, quite so, my dear fellow. Mustn't stop here chatting. Had to apologise, though. Nearly upset this gentleman's table. Can't see where I'm going without my glass. His blind as a bat. Hey, what? Quite so, quite so." He ambled off, doddering cheerfully, while his companion still preserved his look of sulky aloofness. Smith gazed after them with interest. "Can you tell me," he asked of the waiter, who was rallying round with the potatoes, "who that was?" The waiter followed his glance. "Don't know who the young gentleman is, sir. Guest here, I fancy. The old gentleman is the Earl of Emsworth. Lives in the country, doesn't often come to the club. Very absent-minded gentleman, they tell me. Potatoes, sir?" "Thank you," said Smith. The waiter drifted away and returned. "I've been looking at the guest book, sir. The name of the gentleman lunching with Lord Emsworth is Mr. Ralston MacTodd." "Oh, thank you very much. I'm sorry you've had the trouble." "No trouble, sir." Smith resumed his meal. The sullen demeanour of the young man who had accompanied Lord Emsworth through the coffee-room accurately reflected the emotions which were vexing his troubled soul. Ralston MacTodd, the powerful young singer of Saskatoon, plumbs the depths of human emotion and strikes a new note, Montreal Star, very readable, Ypsilanti Herald, had not enjoyed his lunch. The pleasing sense of importance induced by the fact that for the first time in his life he was hobnobbing with a genuine earl had given way, after 10 minutes of his host's society, to a mingled despair and irritation which had grown steadily deeper as the meal proceeded. It is not too much to say that by the time the fish course arrived, it would have been a relief to Mr. Todd's feelings if he could have taken up the butter dish and banged it down, butter and all, on his lordship's bald head. A temperamental young man was Ralston MacTodd. He liked to be the centre of the picture, to do the talking, to air his views, to be listened to respectfully and with interest by a submissive audience. At the meal which had just concluded, none of these reasonable demands had been permitted to him. From the very beginning, Lord Emsworth had collared the conversation and held it with a gentle, bleating persistency against all assault. 5 times had Mr. MacTodd almost succeeded in launching one of his best epigrams, only to see it swept away on the tossing flood of a lecture on hollyhocks. At the 6th attempt he had managed to get it out, complete and sparkling, and the old ass opposite him had taken it in his stride like a hurdle, gone galloping off about the mental and moral defects of a creature named Angus McAllister, who appeared to be his head gardener or something of the kind. The luncheon, though he was a hearty feeder, and as a rule appreciated good cooking, had turned to ashes in Mr. MacTodd's mouth, and it was a soured and chafing singer of Saskatoon who dropped scowlingly into an armchair by the window of the lower smoking-room a few moments later. We introduce Ralston MacTodd to the reader, in short, at a moment when he is very near the breaking point. A little more provocation, goodness knows what he may not do. For the time being, he is merely leaning back in his chair and scowling. He has a faint hope, however, that a cigar may bring some sort of relief, and he is waiting for one to be ordered for him. The Earl of Emsworth did not see the scowl. He had not really seen Mr. MacTodd at all from the moment of his arrival at the club, when somebody who sounded like the head porter had informed him that a gentleman was waiting to see him, and had led him up to a shapeless blur which had introduced itself as his expected guest. The loss of his glasses had had its usual effect on Lord Emsworth, making the world a misty place in which indefinite objects swam dimly like fish in muddy water. Not that this mattered much, seeing that he was in London, for in London there was never anything worth looking at. Beyond a vague feeling that it would be more comfortable on the whole if he had his glasses, a feeling just strong enough to have made him send off a messenger boy to his hotel to hunt for them, Lord Emsworth had not allowed lack of vision to interfere with his enjoyment of the proceedings. And unlike Mr. McTodd, he had been enjoying himself very much. A good listener, this young man, he felt. Very soothing, the way he had constituted himself a willing audience, never interrupting or thrusting himself forward, as is so often the deplorable tendency of the modern young man. Lord Emsworth was bound to admit that, much as he had disliked the idea of going to London to pick up this poet, or whatever he was, the thing had turned out better than he had expected. He liked Mr. McTodd's silent but obvious interest in flowers, his tacit but warm-hearted sympathy in the matter of Angus McAllister. He was glad he was coming to Blandings. It would be agreeable to conduct him personally through the gardens, to introduce him to Angus McAllister, and allow him to plumb for himself the black abysses of that outcast's mental processes. Meanwhile, he had forgotten all about ordering that cigar. "In large gardens, where ample space permits," said Lord Emsworth, dropping cosily into his chair and taking up the conversation at the point where it had been broken off, "nothing is more desirable than that there should be some places, or one at least, of quiet greenery alone without any flowers whatever. I see that you agree with me." Mr. McTodd had not agreed with him. The grunt, which Lord Emsworth had taken for an exclamation of rapturous adhesion to his sentiments, had been merely a sort of bubble of sound rising from the tortured depths of Mr. McTodd's suffering soul. The cry, as the poet beautifully puts it, of some strong smoker in agony. The desire to smoke had now gripped Mr. McTodd's very vitals. But as some lingering remains of the social sense kept him from asking point blank for the cigar for which he yearned, he sought in his mind for a way of approaching the subject obliquely. "In no other way," proceeded Lord Emsworth, "can the brilliancy of flowers be so keenly enjoyed as by—" "Talking of flowers," said Mr. McTodd, "it is a fact, I believe, that tobacco smoke is good for roses." "As by pacing for a time," said Lord Emsworth, "in some cool green alley, and then passing on to the flowery places. It is partly, no doubt, the unconscious working out of some optical law, the explanation of which in everyday language is that the eye—" "Some people say that smoking is bad for the eyes. I don't agree with them," said Mr. McTodd warmly. "Oh, being, as it were, saturated with the green colour, is the more attuned to receive the others, especially the reds. It was probably some such consideration that influenced the designers of the many old gardens of England in devoting so much attention to the cult of the yew tree. When you come to Blandings, my dear fellow, I will show you our celebrated yew alley, and when you see it, you will agree that I was right in taking the stand I did against Angus McAllister's pernicious views." "I was lunching in the club yesterday," said Mr. McTodd, with the splendid McTodd doggedness, "where they had no matches on the tables in the smoking room, only spills. It made it very inconvenient." "Angus McAllister," said Lord Emsworth, "is a professional gardener. I need say no more. You know as well as I do, my dear fellow, what professional gardeners are like when it is a question of moss." "What it meant was that when you wanted to light your after-luncheon cigar, you had to get up and go to the gas burner on a bracket at the other end of the room." "Moss, for some obscure reason, appears to infuriate them. It rouses their basest passions. Nature intended a yew alley to be carpeted with a mossy growth. The mossy path in the yew alley at Blandings is in true relation for colour to the trees and grassy edges. Yet will you credit it that that soulless disgrace to Scotland actually wishes to grub it all up and have a rolled gravel path staring up from beneath those immemorial trees? I've already told you how I was compelled to give in to him in the matter of the hollyhocks. Head gardeners of any ability at all are rare in these days, and one has to make concessions, but this was too much. I was perfectly friendly and civil about it. Certainly, McAllister, I said, you may have your gravel path if you wish it. I make but one proviso, that you construct it over my dead body. Only when I'm weltering in my blood on the threshold of that yew alley shall you disturb 1 inch of my beautiful moss. Try to remember, Mr. McAllister, I said, still quite cordially, that you are not laying out a recreation ground in a Glasgow suburb. You are proposing to make an eyesore of what is possibly the most beautiful nook in one of the finest and oldest gardens in the United Kingdom. He made some repulsive Scotch noise at the back of his throat, and there the matter rests. Let me, my dear fellow, said Lord Emsworth, writhing down into the depths of his chair like an aristocratic snake until his spine rested snugly against the leather. Let me describe for you the yew alley at Blandings. Entering from the west. Mr. McTodd gave up the struggle and sank back, filled with black and deleterious thoughts, into a tobacco-less hell. The smoking room was full now, and on all sides fragrant blue clouds arose from the little groups of serious thinkers who were discussing what Gladstone had said in 78. Mr. McTodd, as he watched them, had something of the emotions of the Peri, excluded from the paradise. So reduced was he by this time that he would have accepted gratefully the meanest straight-cut cigarette in place of the corona of his dreams. But even this poor substitute for smoking was denied him. Lord Emsworth droned on. Having approached from the west, he was now well inside the yew alley. Many of the yews, no doubt, have taken forms other than those that were originally designed. Some are like turned chessmen. Some might be taken for adaptations of human figures, for one can trace here and there a hat-covered head or a spreading petticoat. Some rise in solid blocks with rounded roof and stemless mushroom finial. These have, for the most part, arched recesses forming arbours. One of the tallest... what? Lord Emsworth blinked vaguely at the waiter who had sidled up. A moment before he had been 100-odd miles away, and it was not easy to adjust his mind immediately to the fact that he was in the smoking room of the Senior Conservative Club. What? A messenger boy's just arrived with these, your lordship. Lord Emsworth peered in a dazed and woolly manner at the proffered spectacle case. Intelligence returned to him. Oh, thank you very much. My glasses, capital. Thank you. He removed the glasses from their case, placed them on his nose, and instantly the world sprang into being before his eyes, sharp and well-defined. It was like coming out of a fog. Dear me, he said in a self-congratulatory voice. Then abruptly he sat up, transfixed. The lower smoking room at the Senior Conservative Club is on the street level, and Lord Emsworth's chair faced the large window. Through this, as he raised his now spectacled face, he perceived for the first time that among the row of shops on the opposite side of the road was a jaunty new florist's. It had not been there at his last visit to the metropolis, and he stared at it raptly, as a small boy would stare at a saucer of ice cream if such a thing had suddenly descended from heaven immediately in front of him. And like a small boy in such a situation, he had eyes for nothing else. He did not look at his guest. Indeed, in the ecstasy of his discovery, he had completely forgotten that he had a guest. Any flower shop, however small, was a magnet to the Earl of Emsworth. And this was a particularly spacious and arresting flower shop. Its window was gay with summer blooms, and Lord Emsworth, slowly rising from his chair, pointed like a dog that sees a pheasant. "Bless my soul," he murmured. If the reader has followed with the closeness which it deserves the extremely entertaining conversation of his lordship recorded in the last few paragraphs, he will have noted a reference to hollyhocks. Lord Emsworth had ventilated the hollyhock question at some little length while seated at the luncheon table, but as we had not the good fortune to be present at that enjoyable meal, a brief résumé of the situation must now be given, and the intelligent public allowed to judge between his lordship and the uncompromising McAllister. Briefly, the position was this. Many head gardeners are apt to favour in the hollyhock forms that one cannot but think have for their aim an ideal that is a false and unworthy one. Angus McAllister, clinging to the head gardener-esque standard of beauty and correct form, would not sanction the wide outer petal. The flower, so Angus held, must be very tight and very round, like the uniform of the Major General. Lord Emsworth, on the other hand, considered this view narrow and claimed the liberty to try for the very highest and truest beauty in hollyhocks. The loosely folded inner petals of the hollyhock, he considered, invited a wonderful play and brilliancy of colour, while the wide outer petal, with its slightly waved surface and gently frilled edge. Well, anyway, Lord Emsworth liked his hollyhocks floppy, and Angus McAllister liked them tight. And bitter warfare had resulted, in which, as we've seen, his lordship had been compelled to give way. He'd been brooding on this defeat ever since, and in the florist opposite he saw a possible sympathiser, a potential ally, an intelligent chum with whom he could get together and thoroughly damn Angus McAllister's Glaswegian obstinacy. You would not have suspected Lord Emsworth, from a casual glance, of having within him the ability to move rapidly. But it is a fact that he was out of the smoking room and skimming down the front steps of the club before Mr. McTodd's jaw, which had fallen at the spectacle of his host bounding out of his horizon of vision like a jackrabbit, had time to hitch itself up again. A moment later, Mr. McTodd, happening to direct his gaze out of the window, saw him whiz across the road and vanish into the florist's shop. It was at this juncture that Psmith, having finished his lunch, came downstairs to enjoy a quiet cup of coffee. The room was rather crowded, and the chair which Lord Emsworth had vacated offered a wide invitation. He made his way to it. "Is this chair occupied?" he inquired politely. So politely that Mr. McTodd's reply sounded by contrast even more violent than it might otherwise have done. "No, it isn't," snapped Mr. McTodd. Psmith seated himself. He was feeling agreeably disposed to conversation. "Lord Emsworth has left you, then?" he said. "Is he a friend of yours?" inquired Mr. McTodd, in a voice that suggested that he was perfectly willing to accept a proxy as a target for his wrath. "I know him by sight, nothing more." "Blast him!" muttered McTodd with indescribable virulence. Psmith eyed him inquiringly. "Correct me if I'm wrong," he said, "but I seem to detect in your manner a certain half-veiled annoyance. Is anything the matter?" Mr. McTodd barked bitterly. "Oh, no, nothing's the matter, nothing whatever, except that old beaver—" Here he wronged Lord Emsworth, who, whatever his faults, was not a bearded man. "That old beaver invited me to lunch, talked all the time about his infernal flowers, never let me get a word in edgeways, hadn't the common civility to offer me a cigar, and now has gone off without a word of apology and buried himself in that shop over the way. I've never been so insulted in my life," raved Mr. McTodd. "Scarcely the perfect host," admitted Psmith. "And if he thinks," said Mr. McTodd, rising, "that I'm going to go and stay with him at his beastly castle after this, he's mistaken. I'm supposed to go down there with him this evening, and perhaps the old fossil thinks I will. After this—" "Ha ha ha ha!" Horrid laugh rolled up from Mr. McTodd's interior. "Ha ha! Unlikely! I see myself after being insulted like this. Would you?" he demanded. Psmith gave the matter thought. "I'm inclined to think no." "So am I damned well inclined to think no," cried Mr. McTodd. "I'm going away now, this very minute, and if that old total loss ever comes back, you can tell him he's seen the last of me." And Ralston McTodd, his blood boiling with justifiable indignation and pique to a degree dangerous on such a warm day, stalked off towards the door with a hard, set face. Through the door he stalked to the cloakroom for his hat and cane. Then, his lips moving silently, he stalked through the hall, stalked down the steps, and passed from the scene, stalking furiously round the corner in quest of a tobacconist's. At the moment of his disappearance, the Earl of Emsworth had just begun to give the sympathetic florist a limpid character sketch of Angus McAllister. Smith shook his head sadly. These clashings of human temperament were very lamentable. They disturbed the after-luncheon repose of the man of sensibility. He ordered coffee and endeavoured to forget the painful scene by thinking of Eve Halliday.